In the stillness of the desert night, before the world knew kings or kingdoms, two rivers whispered across the barren land. The Tigris and the Euphrates, wild and restless, carved green veins into a sea of dust. Between them stretched a fertile crescent, a cradle that would rock the infant of human civilization. Here, thousands of years ago, men and women set down their wandering feet and planted the first seeds of permanence. It was not an easy home. The rivers could flood with fury, swallowing fields and huts, then shrink away in times of drought, leaving cracked earth behind. Yet in this dance of abundance and destruction, humanity learned patience. In foresight and the art of bending nature to will, canals were dug, dikes were raised, and the muddy water that once brought terror was turned into life. In time, the scattered huts grew into villages, the villages into cities, and the cities into the first great empires the world had ever seen. From the reed-strewn banks rose temples shaped like mountains, ziggurats reaching toward the heavens. From clay tablets pressed by stylus came the first written words, fragile yet immortal. In Mesopotamia, kings ruled not only with the sword, but with symbols, laws carved in stone, myths etched into memory, rituals carried in procession. Here, war was invented, but so too was peace. Here, tyranny was born, but also justice. Here, the Epic of Gilgamesh dreamed of immortality, while Hammurabi wrote of fairness. And though the empires would rise and fall like the waters of the rivers, something endured. The pulse of Mesopotamia still echoes in our alphabets, in our calendars, in the very idea of civilization itself. So let us drift back, slowly, as if falling asleep by the sound of flowing water. Let us walk again under the Mesopotamian sky, through fields of barley and into the shadow of Uruk's walls. Let us remember the first cities, the first laws, the first dreams of mankind. For it is here, between two rivers, that history first opened its eyes. Long before the sound of armies clashing or the chants of priests rose in temples, there was only the sound of water. The Tigris and Euphrates, twisting like twin serpents through an arid land, gave Mesopotamia both its name and its destiny. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. Without them, it would have been a barren wilderness. With them, it became the nursery of civilization. Each spring, as the snows melted from distant mountains, the rivers swelled with power. Brown torrents surged across the plains, drowning fields and scattering flocks. Families watched the waters rise with both fear and hope. For when the floods retreated, they left behind a dark silt richer than any treasure. In that soil, barley and wheat sprouted in abundance, enough to feed not only families, but entire cities. The people of Mesopotamia came to see the rivers as both gods and monsters, bringers of plenty and of ruin. To survive, they learned the art of control. They dug canals with simple tools, diverting water into thirsty fields. They built levees to protect their homes from sudden floods. What began as small irrigation ditches soon spread into vast networks, binding villages together in shared labor. For the first time in history, humans bent a landscape to their collective will. The land gave more than it took, and from its abundance, communities flourished. Life along the rivers was rhythmic. At dawn, farmers guided oxen across fields, pressing wooden plows into the damp earth. Children carried jars of water drawn from the canals, balancing them carefully on their shoulders. Women ground grain into flour, their stone tools echoing with steady music. And when the sun burned low, fishermen cast their nets into the calm streams, bringing home silver-scaled gifts of the river. But survival required more than toil. The rivers were unpredictable, and no dam could hold back their full rage. One year the floods came too high, sweeping away huts and drowning harvests. Another year, they failed to come at all, leaving dust and famine. To the people of Mesopotamia, these changes were not merely accidents of nature, they were signs of divine will, and so they prayed to the spirits of the rivers, leaving offerings of bread and beer along the banks, whispering for mercy as the waters rose. The dual nature of the rivers shaped the duality of Mesopotamian life. Here was a land where humans dreamed of permanence, yet lived at the mercy of forces beyond their control. It was a tension that taught them humility, but also ambition. In their minds grew the seed of something greater if the rivers could be tamed. Perhaps the world itself could be ordered. From this desire for order came innovation. Clay tablets record the earliest calendars, carefully tracking the cycles of flooding and planting. Priests studied the stars, linking the rhythms of heaven with the rhythms of the rivers. Farmers learned to store grain in clay jars, guarding against lean years. Each problem demanded a solution, and each solution carried humanity one step closer to civilization. It is easy, in the stillness of modern life, to forget how fragile it all was. A family's survival might depend on whether the canal was cleared of silt that season. A village's safety could rest on whether a levee held during the night. The rivers, beautiful and terrifying, offered no promises. Yet from their restless waters flowed not only crops but also courage, cooperation, and creativity. And so, as the moon rose over the water's surface, villagers would gather at the banks. The air smelled of damp earth, and the frogs sang in chorus. Elders told stories of the first floods, of ancestors who built the first dikes, of gods who watched over the currents. Children listened, wide-eyed, lulled by the sound of water lapping against the shore. It was a song older than memory, and it carried within it the beginnings of history. The Tigris and Euphrates did more than quench thirst or nourish fields. They whispered to humanity that permanence was possible, that the future could be shaped by human hands. Between their banks, people ceased to wander, and the first foundations of civilization were laid. The rivers breathed life, and mankind, at last, learned how to breathe with them. From the quiet banks of the rivers, life began to gather in clusters. First came villages of mud brick huts, their walls plastered with clay and straw. Then, as the years passed, these villages grew larger, tied together by irrigation canals, by trade, and by shared temples. What began as clusters of families became the world's first cities, places where humanity's restless energy found a new home. Among them, one name still echoes through the corridors of time: Uruk. To approach Uruk in its glory was to see a marvel unlike anything the world had known. Its walls, massive and gleaming in the sun, stretched farther than any eye could measure, enclosing bustling streets filled with merchants, craftsmen, and priests. Within those walls rose the great ziggurat of the sky god, Anu, a temple shaped like a mountain, as if humans were daring to build steps toward heaven itself. The city hummed with life. Potters turned clay into jars and bowls, each one stamped with symbols of ownership. Weavers sat at looms, spinning wool into garments traded for timber and metals from far-off lands. Scribes pressed reed styluses into wet tablets, recording harvests, debts, and prayers. And above it all, the priest-kings presided, balancing the worldly needs of their people with the mysterious demands of the gods. Uruk was not alone. To the south rose Ur, a city crowned by the great ziggurat of Nana, the moon god. Ur became a place of wealth, its streets lined with traders who carried lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, and gold from distant mountains. Its harbor bustled with boats heavy with grain, fish, and wool, sailing down the rivers toward the Persian Gulf. By night, under the glow of the moon, the city seemed to breathe with its god, its people whispering prayers to the sky. Farther still lay Lagash, another jewel of Sumer, a city known not only for its temples but for its inscriptions, the first records of kings, conquests, and contracts. On its stone steles, rulers carved the story of battles fought and justice given, of fields divided and boundaries marked. In Lagash, the idea of law itself began to take form, written in symbols that could outlast the breath of men. What made these cities extraordinary was not only their size, but their spirit. For the first time, humanity lived in spaces where thousands of strangers shared walls, markets, and beliefs. Here, cooperation was no longer optional, but essential. Bakers relied on farmers. Farmers relied on potters. Potters relied on merchants. And all relied on the scribes who kept track of promises. Out of this web of need and trust came something new, the sense of society, larger than family, larger even than tribe. But the city was not only a place of order, it was a place of wonder. Festivals filled the streets with music and dance. Priests carried statues of the gods through processions, their golden eyes gleaming in the torchlight. Children chased each other through narrow alleys, while elders told tales of Gilgamesh, the great king of Uruk, who sought immortality and returned with wisdom instead. Yet beneath the glory was fragility. Cities demanded constant labor to maintain canals, walls, and temples. A season of drought or a breach in the levee could bring hunger. Rivalries flared between neighbors, and armies marched across the flat plains with ease. The cities of Mesopotamia, magnificent as they were, lived always under the shadow of uncertainty. Still, to walk their streets was to step into the birth of civilization itself. These were places where humans first asked questions that reached beyond survival. What is justice? What is power? What is the will of the gods? The answers they sought, written in clay and carved in stone, would echo for millennia. As the sun set over Uruk, painting the walls in hues of red and gold, the city stirred with life. Smoke curled from kitchens. Chants drifted from temples. Merchants closed their stalls, and the people gathered on rooftops to watch the first stars appear. And as the Tigris and Euphrates shimmered in the distance, the world's first cities stood proud. Proof that humanity had learned not only to endure, but to build. In the heart of every Mesopotamian city, one structure towered above all others, the temple, rising like a man-made mountain from the flat plain. The ziggurat was both a monument and a message. Its great steps led not only upward into the sky, but also inward into the mystery of divine power. To live in Mesopotamia was to live under the shadow of gods, and to believe that kings and priests were their chosen servants on earth. At first, the priests alone governed. They measured the fields, distributed grain, and led rituals that sought to soothe the temper of the rivers and the will of the heavens. Their word carried the weight of the divine, for to disobey a priest was to disobey the gods themselves. The temple was the center of life, its courtyard thronged with worshippers bringing offerings, its storage rooms filled with grain and wool collected as tribute, its altars stained with the smoke of sacrifice. But as the cities grew, so too did their dangers. Rival towns fought over water rights, trade routes, and boundaries of fertile land. Armies of spear-bearing men began to march across the plains, and the temple alone could not protect its people. From this need emerged a new figure, the priest-king, a ruler who was at once defender of the city and mediator with the gods. These early kings were unlike monarchs of later times. They did not stand apart from religion, but were steeped in it. Their palaces rose beside temples. Their decrees carried the seal of the divine. When they went to war, it was not merely for territory, it was to fulfill what they claimed was the will of the gods. Victory was celebrated with processions into the temple. Defeat was explained as punishment for neglecting divine duties. The ziggurat embodied this union of heaven and earth. Its solid base, of sun-baked brick, anchored it to the mortal world, while its ascending terraces reached toward the stars. At its summit stood a shrine where priests performed rites and where, it was believed, the gods might descend to walk among men. To climb its steps was to ascend into the realm of the sacred, leaving behind the noise of the marketplace and the dust of the fields. Life within the temple complex was busy and ordered. Scribes kept meticulous records of offerings barley, sheep, jars of oil donated by families hoping for blessing. Musicians played harps and drums during ceremonies, their rhythms echoing through the courtyards. Sacrifices of animals, grain, and incense filled the air with the mingled scent of blood and smoke. Festivals turned the city into a living prayer, with statues of gods carried through the streets, garlanded with flowers and shimmering in gold. The power of the priest-kings was both practical and symbolic. On one hand, they directed the construction of canals, walls, and granaries, ensuring the survival of their people. On the other, they embodied the fragile hope that the gods had not abandoned humanity. When the floods came too high or the fields withered, it was the king who fasted, prayed, and offered gifts to win back divine favor. His failure was more than political, it was cosmic. And yet, for all their grandeur, kings were still mortal. Their names were carved on steles, their deeds sung by poets. But the clay tablets also recorded their deaths, their struggles, and their successes. Over centuries, dynasties rose and fell, and temples were rebuilt upon older ruins, layer upon layer, as if each new generation sought to reach heaven a little higher than the last. To walk through a Mesopotamian city was to feel this constant intertwining of earth and sky. The markets bustled with merchants, the workshops rang with tools, but always, looming above, was the temple, a silent reminder that no matter how great men might become, the gods were greater still. At night, when the ziggurats' shadow stretched across the streets, families lit small lamps and whispered prayers. They believed the gods watched from above, their gaze resting on every field, every child, every humble offering. And so the city lived, suspended between clay and eternity, ruled by men who claimed to speak with the voice of heaven. There is a moment in human history when memory left the fragile vessel of the mind and found permanence in clay. That moment began in Mesopotamia, long before parchment or paper, long before alphabets and printing presses. The people of the two rivers pressed reeds into wet tablets and gave the world its first written words. At first, writing was practical, almost humble. Farmers brought jars of grain to the temple, and scribes needed a way to keep count. Merchants bartered wool for timber, and contracts had to be remembered beyond the fallibility of speech. So the Mesopotamians shaped lumps of clay, soft and ready, and with the cut end of a reed stylus, they pressed wedge-shaped marks into the surface. This system, known as cuneiform, was simple in appearance, but profound in consequence. For the first time, thoughts could survive the death of the thinker. In storerooms and archives, rows of tablets piled up. Some listed rations of barley, others recorded taxes, others noted prayers to the gods. Scribes became indispensable. Their training was long and demanding, for to master cuneiform was to learn hundreds of signs, each with shifting meanings. But once mastered, it gave a kind of power no sword could match, the ability to command memory itself. Over time, writing leapt beyond numbers and inventories. The clay began to hold poems, hymns, laws, and myths. Among these, one tale rose above the rest. The story of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk. In its verses, carved into tablets that have endured for over 4,000 years, humanity spoke of its deepest fears and longings. Gilgamesh, part man and part god, achieved victories beyond measure, yet was haunted by the shadow of death. He sought immortality, journeyed across deserts and seas, only to discover that no man could escape the final silence. His tale was not just a king's story, it was humanity's first meditation on life and loss. Imagine a temple scribe, by the flicker of an oil lamp, pressing these lines into wet clay. His hand trembles slightly, but his marks are steady. Each wedge a fragment of eternity. He cannot know that millennia later, scholars in distant lands will cradle these fragments in their own hands, reading the words as if they were written yesterday. The written word transformed Mesopotamian life. It preserved laws so that justice would not be forgotten. It recorded treaties so that promises could outlast rulers. It stored myths so that gods and heroes would live beyond the fall of empires. Writing was, in truth, the first step toward immortality, not of flesh, but of thought. Children of scribes were trained from youth, sitting in dusty courtyards, copying signs onto tablets. Teachers corrected their strokes harshly, for a single mark could change the meaning of an entire contract. Study your tablets. One ancient exercise reads, so that your hand will be skilled, and your words will bring honor to your family. To be a scribe was to step into a select order, one that stood between the common people and the mysteries of record and law. Cuneiform spread from city to city, from Sumer to Akkad, from Babylonia to Assyria. Each empire used it, adapted it, refined it, and in its endurance, it outlived them all. While kings vanished and cities crumbled, their words remained, pressed into clay, silent but eternal. To walk into a Mesopotamian archive was to enter a forest of knowledge. Thousands of tablets rested in baskets and shelves, their surfaces crowded with marks. Some told of mundane matters: 2 jars of beer delivered, 3 sheep borrowed. Others carried prayers to the gods, whispered by those long gone. Together, they formed the first library of humankind. It is said that civilizations begin with stories, and Mesopotamia gave us the first written ones, from Bali accounts to the Epic of Gilgamesh, from legal codes to star charts. The people of the 2 rivers discovered that to write was to resist the river of time itself, and though their empires fell, their words remained, whispering across the ages, reminding us that memory, once etched into clay, could outlast even stone. As the cities of Mesopotamia grew in size and complexity, so too did their disputes. Farmers quarreled over irrigation canals. Merchants argued about weights and measures. Families contested inheritances. Life in the bustling cities could no longer rely on memory, custom, or priestly judgment alone. Something more permanent was needed, something carved not into fragile memory but into stone. It was in this moment that the world first encountered a bold idea, a written code of law. The most famous of these belonged to Hammurabi, king of Babylon in the 18th century BCE. Hammurabi was more than a conqueror. He was a statesman who understood that empire was not held together by swords alone. In his reign, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the upper reaches of the Euphrates, he ordered a vast collection of laws to be inscribed in cuneiform on stone steles. These laws would stand in public squares, visible to all, so that even the humblest farmer might know the boundaries of justice. The Code of Hammurabi was both stern and practical. It laid out rules for trade, marriage, property, debt, and crime. It spoke of builders who must be held accountable for the strength of their houses, of merchants who must use honest scales, of sons who must honor their fathers, and of masters who bore responsibility for their slaves. Its punishments were famously harsh: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but in them lay a principle the world had never seen before: that law should be predictable, written, and binding on all. To walk through Babylon and see the great black stele standing tall was to feel the presence of order itself. At its top was carved the image of Hammurabi receiving the laws from Shamash, the sun god of justice. The message was clear: these laws were not merely human decrees, but divine commands, given for the good of the people. To obey them was to keep harmony. To break them was to defy both king and god. Imagine the people gathered around the stele as the scribe read its words aloud. A farmer nods, reassured that his neighbor cannot steal his ox without facing judgment. A merchant listens carefully, knowing his debts must be honored with precision. A widow takes comfort that her rights to inheritance are protected. For the first time, justice was not a mystery, whispered by priests or decided by the whim of rulers. It was written in stone for all to see. Of course, the law was not equal for everyone. A nobleman's crime was punished differently from a commoner's, and slaves bore the heaviest burdens. Yet even in this inequality lay the seed of something revolutionary: the recognition that society needed rules that were known, recorded, and enduring. No longer would disputes dissolve into endless cycles of revenge. Now, there was a framework, even if imperfect, that sought to guide human behavior. The code shaped daily life in ways subtle and profound. Farmers arranged marriages with contracts etched in clay. Merchants sealed deals with written agreements. Builders measured their work against the threat of legal penalty. In every corner of Babylon, the weight of law pressed as surely as the desert sun. And though Hammurabi himself would pass into dust, his laws endured. Fragments of his code traveled across centuries, influencing later civilizations, from the Hebrews to the Greeks, from the Romans to modern nations. The idea that justice must be written, visible, and accessible did not die with Babylon. It became part of the very foundation of human society. At dusk, when the torchlight flickered against the stele, the people of Babylon may have seen not just words on stone, but a promise that life need not be ruled by chaos alone. The rivers could flood, empires could fall, but as long as law was remembered, a measure of order might survive. In Mesopotamia, justice was born, not in the whispers of a judge, but in the permanence of stone. And in that permanence, humanity took another step away from the uncertainty of nature and toward the fragile dream of civilization. For centuries, the cities of Mesopotamia thrived in rivalry, each proud of its walls, its temples, and its gods. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Kish, each rose, each contended, each sought supremacy, yet none could dominate for long. The rivers gave life, but they also divided, and so the land between them became a patchwork of city-states, each fiercely independent, each vulnerable to ambition. Then came a man who dreamed not of one city, But of all of them, his name was Sargon of Akkad. The story of Sargon begins not with a crown, but with a basket. Ancient texts tell us he was abandoned at birth, placed in a reed basket, and set adrift on the river, a tale that would echo in later myths. He was rescued, raised humbly, and rose through cunning and talent to become the cupbearer of the king of Kish. Yet service was not enough for him. When opportunity came, Sargon seized power, gathered soldiers, and declared himself ruler. But unlike others before him, he did not stop at his own gates. Sargon forged an army unlike any Mesopotamia had seen, with bronze weapons gleaming and disciplined ranks. His soldiers marched not merely to defend, but to conquer. City after city fell. Uruk, Ur, Lagash. The scribes record that Sargon subdued 34 cities, binding them under his rule. For the first time in history, Mesopotamia was no longer a land of rivals, but an empire. The Akkadian Empire was more than conquest, it was a vision. Sargon established a new capital, Akkad, whose exact ruins remain hidden from us, but whose power thundered across the land. He appointed governors to oversee provinces, established a standing army, and spread the Akkadian language as the new tongue of administration and culture. Trade routes stretched farther than ever before, linking the riches of Anatolia, Persia, and the Indus Valley. The land between the rivers pulsed with new energy, drawn not from the rivalry of cities, but from the might of one ruler's ambition. Yet empires, like rivers, carry both promise and peril. Conquest brought wealth, but it also brought resistance. The cities resented Akkadian governors, resented taxes, resented the loss of their independence. Revolts flared, and Sargon was forced to march again and again, stamping out rebellion with iron will. To maintain unity, he relied not only on the sword but also on the claim that he ruled by divine favor. In inscriptions, he declared himself king of the four corners of the world. The language was bold, even shocking for the first time. A man claimed dominion over all that the sun touched. But even as Sargon expanded outward, storms gathered within. The empire stretched far, perhaps too far for the fragile systems of canals and clay to support. Famine is said to have struck. Enemies pressed on the borders, and though Sargon reigned for decades, his death left a fragile legacy. His grandsons, notably Naram-Sin, sought to continue his vision, carving their victories into steles, calling themselves even gods. Yet pride too great often draws the wrath of heaven or of history. The Akkadian Empire, first of its kind, would not endure forever. Drought, invasion, rebellion, all would conspire to bring it low. Its fall would leave ruins, but also a lesson that ambition can bind lands together, but also crack them apart. Still, for a moment in time, Sargon's dream seemed unstoppable. Imagine the sight: an army of thousands marching across the Mesopotamian plain, dust rising like smoke, bronze glinting in the sun, banners of Akkad snapping in the wind. In the cities, the people must have watched with awe and dread, knowing that history itself was shifting before their eyes. And so we pause, at the height of Sargon's triumph, with the Akkadian Empire blazing like a torch against the dark. But torches, no matter how bright, burn quickly. What came next would test not only the empire but the very land of the two rivers, for even the mightiest rulers cannot command the sky, nor silence the rivers when they turn against man. Beyond the clash of armies and the rise of empires, another force quietly shaped Mesopotamia trade. The land between the rivers was fertile, but it lacked many essential resources: stone, timber, precious metals, to build their cities and fuel their ambitions. The people of Mesopotamia had to look outward, weaving themselves into a vast web of exchange that reached far beyond the desert horizon. Picture the markets of Babylon or Ur. Stalls lined the streets, shaded with reed mats. Merchants called out their wares jars of sesame oil, baskets of barley, bundles of wool dyed in vibrant colors. The air smelled of spices and smoke, of animals and fresh bread. Coins did not yet exist. Instead, trade relied on weighed silver, counted barley, and tablets that recorded promises. A handshake might seal a deal, but the clay tablet preserved it. From these markets, caravans departed, their donkeys laden with goods. Southward, they traveled to the Persian Gulf, where boats carried cargo to lands beyond the sea. Northward, they marched into the mountains, bringing back copper and tin, the metals that, when joined, created bronze, the lifeblood of tools and weapons. Eastward, they reached toward Persia and the Indus Valley, where exotic gems and ivory awaited. Westward, they touched the Levant, exchanging grain for cedar wood, prized for its strength and scent. Each journey was perilous. Caravans crossed deserts where water was scarce and bandits lurked. Boats sailed rivers that could turn violent with floods. Yet the promise of wealth outweighed the dangers. Traders became the lifeline of Mesopotamian cities, carrying not only goods but also ideas, stories, and gods. With every exchange, the world grew a little larger. Bronze, above all, transformed society. Harder than stone, sharper than copper. It gave farmers plows that cut deeper into the soil, carpenters axes that could shape wood with precision, soldiers weapons that gleamed with deadly power. A city rich in bronze could feed more mouths, build stronger walls, and defend itself with greater force. But bronze depended on trade. For its ingredients, copper and tin were rare in Mesopotamia. Thus the cities were bound not only to their rivers but to faraway mines and distant partners. The wealth that flowed through the cities built more than armies. It built temples clad in gold, statues of gods adorned with lapis lazuli, palaces where kings dined on meats and fruits carried from afar. Musicians played lyres with strings of imported metal, while jewelers set stones into necklaces that caught the torchlight at feasts. In the ziggurats, priests burned incense from distant lands, their smoke curling upward as if carrying prayers beyond the horizon. Trade also brought encounters with strangers. A merchant from Ur might learn new words from a trader out of Anatolia, or hear of distant kings in Elam or Egypt. Myths and rituals traveled as surely as goods. The Mesopotamian gods were mighty, but they were never alone. Foreign deities slipped into the pantheon, their names whispered alongside the old. Civilization itself was becoming interconnected, yet wealth was never without risk. Inequality deepened as merchants grew rich while farmers toiled in the fields. Rival cities fought for control of trade routes, their armies clashing along dusty roads, and always, behind the prosperity, loomed the fragility of dependence. If the caravans failed, if the mines closed, if the seas turned hostile, the cities could not sustain their splendor. Still, the memory of Mesopotamia is filled not only with war and law, but with the hum of markets and the glow of prosperity. It was here that humanity first built economies, first charted trade routes. The first discovered that the world was wider than any single horizon. As the sun set over Ur, the streets glowed with lamplight. Merchants counted silver under the watchful eyes of scribes. Caravans prepared to depart at dawn, their donkeys braying in the night, and somewhere in the dark, a craftsman shaped bronze into a blade that would outlast his own lifetime. Trade and wealth were the quiet rivers beneath the louder currents of war and kingship. Without them, the cities could not stand. With them, Mesopotamia reached out across the world, leaving behind not only ruins of stone but also the first great web of human connection. If law and trade bound Mesopotamian life by day, then myth and ritual carried it through the night. To live between the Tigris and Euphrates was to live under the watchful gaze of gods, many, powerful, and often unpredictable. The people believed their fate was woven not only in the floods and harvests, but in the will of divine beings whose moods could shape the world. The Mesopotamian pantheon was vast. At its head stood Anu, Lord of the heavens, and Enlil, god of air and storms, whose word could grant kingship or strip it away. Enki, god of wisdom and water, was the trickster, offering knowledge and sometimes mischief. The moon shone with the presence of Nana, while the blazing sun carried Shamash, guardian of justice. And above all, the people feared and adored Ishtar, goddess of love and war, whose power could bring both fertility and ruin. In the temples, these gods were not distant abstractions, but living presences. Priests dressed their statues in fine garments, placed crowns of gold on their heads, and set meals of bread, beer, and meat before them each day. When a city triumphed in war, its victors might carry off the statue of a rival's god, believing they had captured not only stone, but the very spirit of protection. To lose one's god was to lose hope itself. Ritual filled the calendar. At dawn, incense rose into the sky, carrying prayers with it. Festivals brought the whole city into celebration, with processions of statues through crowded streets, drums pounding, flute singing. In spring, fertility rites honored the sacred marriage between gods and goddesses, asking that the fields too might be fruitful. At night, kings sometimes joined these rituals, standing as the earthly partners of the gods. binding heaven and earth together in sacred union. Dreams were seen as messages. A farmer who dreamed of a river overflowing might rush to the temple to ask if a flood was coming. A soldier who dreamed of lions could believe victory awaited him. Priests specialized in interpreting these visions, recording them on clay tablets, building one of the first great collections of human psychology. To dream was not private, it was to touch the realm of gods. The myths told in Mesopotamia revealed both awe and anxiety. In the epic of creation, the world was born not from harmony, but from struggle, as the younger gods fought the chaos monster Tiamat. Shaping order out of violence, humanity, according to another tale, was fashioned from clay mixed with divine blood, created to bear the burden of labor for the gods. The message was clear: men and women existed not to command, but to serve. Yet within these myths lay reflections of human longing. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, raged against mortality, journeyed across the earth, and returned to his city, resigned to human limits, but wiser in heart. His story carried a lesson: even kings could not defy death, but they could live through the memory of their deeds and the strength of their cities. Ordinary life was never far from these beliefs. A mother whispered to Ishtar as she held her sick child. A farmer poured the first jar of beer onto the earth in thanks to Enki. A merchant prayed to Shamash before departing on a long caravan, asking for fairness in his trade. Faith was not confined to temples. It was woven into every act of survival. But the gods were not gentle protectors. They were capricious, reflecting the unpredictable nature of the rivers and the sky. Floods, droughts, plagues, invasions, all were seen as divine punishment. Kings fasted and sacrificed, hoping to appease the heavens. Scribes recorded omens in the flight of birds, the shape of livers from sacrificed animals, the paths of stars. Every sign mattered, for the gods spoke in whispers scattered across the world. As night fell, the city glowed with oil lamps. From the ziggurat came chants and drums, their echoes rising into the star-filled sky. Families gathered on rooftops, telling stories of gods who fought, loved, and dreamed just as men did. In their myths, they saw both the grandeur of the cosmos and the fragility of their own lives. And in that fragile space between fear and wonder, civilization found meaning. Civilizations rise like the swelling of rivers, but just as surely, they fall. For all their temples and walls, the cities of Mesopotamia could not escape the weight of time, the land between the rivers. So fertile and rich, became both a treasure and a target. And from beyond the horizon came waves of peoples: Hittites, Assyrians, Persians, each reshaping the destiny of Mesopotamia. The first blow fell from the west. In the 16th century BCE, the Hittites, fierce warriors from Anatolia, swept into Babylon. Their chariots rattled across the plains, their iron weapons gleaming against the sun. For a moment, Babylon's proud walls could not protect it. The city was sacked, its treasures carried off, its gods humiliated. Though the Hittites did not stay, their invasion left scars. a reminder that no city was invincible. Next came the Assyrians, rising from the north. They were not content with raids, they sought empire. From Ashur to Nineveh, their kings forged a war machine unmatched in its cruelty and efficiency. Armies of iron-clad soldiers, supported by siege engines and swift chariots, descended upon Mesopotamia's cities. Their reputation for terror was deliberate. Conquered peoples were deported. Rebellious cities burned. Enemies impaled as warnings. Under the Assyrians, Mesopotamia became part of a vast dominion that stretched from Egypt to Persia. Yet even within this storm, Mesopotamia's brilliance flickered. Assyrian kings built libraries, gathering thousands of clay tablets from across the land. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh preserved hymns, laws, and the epic of Gilgamesh itself. Brutality and culture walked side by side, as if the gods themselves could not decide whether to bless or curse the empire. But empires built on fear seldom endure. The Assyrians fell, their cities turned to ruins. Out of the east came the Persians, led by Cyrus the Great. Unlike the Assyrians, Cyrus entered Babylon not with fire, but with respect. In 539 BCE, his army marched through its gates, and the city opened without bloodshed. Cyrus declared himself chosen by Marduk, Babylon's god, and allowed exiled peoples such as the Jews to return to their homelands. In his reign, Mesopotamia became part of a far larger empire, one that stretched from the Indus to the Aegean. Under Persian rule, Babylon remained a jewel, its gardens and walls admired even by conquerors. Yet it was no longer the master of its destiny. The city that had once commanded an empire was now a province. Its grandeur preserved, but its independence gone. The decline of Mesopotamia was not sudden but gradual. Like a river changing course, soil, once fertile, grew weary under centuries of cultivation. Canals silted up, new trade routes bypassed the old cities. As power shifted westward to Greece and later to Rome, the once mighty cradle of civilization became a shadow of its former self. Still, the ruins told their own story. Travelers gazed at the fallen ziggurats, the broken walls, the silent temples, and wondered at the greatness that had been Poses. In the myths of Gilgamesh, in the laws of Hammurabi, in the clay tablets buried deep in the earth, Mesopotamia's voice endured even as its cities crumbled. Imagine standing on the walls of Babylon as the Persians entered. The streets were hushed, the air heavy with dust. Some citizens trembled, fearing slaughter. Others sighed in relief, weary of Assyrian cruelty. The gods' statues were paraded once more, their faces polished, their names invoked by a foreign king who promised to honor them. For a moment, Babylon lived again. Yet the people must have known the age of their independence was gone, swallowed by empires larger than any city could resist. Decline did not erase Mesopotamia, but it transformed it. The land between the rivers, once the center of the world, became a chapter in the greater story of conquest. And though the Hittites, Assyrians, and Persians each left their mark, It was the memory of Mesopotamia itself, its rivers, its laws, its myths that endured longest of all. Though its empires fell, though its ziggurats crumbled and its canals ran dry, Mesopotamia never truly disappeared. The land between the rivers became a memory. But its memory lived on in every civilization that followed. To speak of Mesopotamia is to speak of origins, the beginning of so much that defines human life today. Consider the simplest act writing. Each time a hand scratches words onto paper, or a finger taps letters onto a screen, it echoes the first stylus pressing into clay. From humble records of grain to the grand tale of Gilgamesh, Mesopotamia gave humanity the gift of memory beyond death. Without it, history itself would be impossible. Or think of law. When modern courts weigh fairness, when judges consult written codes, they walk in the footsteps of Hammurabi, his stone stele, standing tall in the public square, declared that justice must be visible, not whispered in secret. Though his punishments may seem harsh, the principle that law binds ruler and subject alike was revolutionary. Even the rhythm of life owes something to Mesopotamia. Calendars were charted there, with priests watching the stars to predict the floods. Hours, minutes, and seconds. The division of time into 60 parts was a Mesopotamian invention. Each clock that ticks today carries within it the legacy of the two rivers. In architecture, their temples taught later peoples to build toward the sky. In religion, their myths of floods, of heroes, of quests for immortality, shaped stories from the Hebrew Bible to Greek epics. In trade, their caravans and boats opened paths that later empires would follow. From Egypt to India, from Greece to Rome, whispers of Mesopotamia flowed like the rivers themselves. But perhaps the greatest legacy was not in what Mesopotamia built, but in what it imagined. The people of the two rivers were the first to dream of permanence. They took fragile mud and shaped it into cities, into words, into laws. They lived knowing the rivers could destroy them, yet they dared to build anyway. In their courage lay the seed of civilization, the belief that humanity could order the world, even if imperfectly. Travelers who walked among the ruins centuries later felt both awe and melancholy. Greek historians wrote of Babylon's grandeur, its walls so vast that chariots could race upon them, its gardens hanging like a wonder of the world. Yet they also saw silence where once had been music, dust where once had been markets. Civilizations had risen elsewhere, but the memory of Mesopotamia lingered like a ghost, reminding them that all greatness carries within it the shadow of decline. Still, Mesopotamia's voice speaks across time. Every library, every courthouse, every city with markets and temples and laws is in some sense its descendant. We may not see the clay tablets, the reed styluses, the bronze blades, but their echoes live in our alphabets, our governments, our very sense of history. Imagine standing today on the banks of the Euphrates, the sun setting over fields of barley. The ruins of Uruk lie silent, yet the wind carries whispers. The ziggurats may have fallen, but the idea they embodied, the yearning to reach higher, to touch eternity, still burns within us. Civilization is not immortal, but its dreams are. Mesopotamia reminds us of both our fragility and our strength. Empires crumble. Rivers change course. Yet the words written in clay, the laws carved in stone, the myths told under the stars endure. They survive because they speak to something timeless in the human spirit, the desire to be remembered, to give meaning to the fleeting span of life. And so, as we close the story of Mesopotamia, we do not close it entirely. Its legacy flows onward, like the rivers themselves, winding into every age that followed. To fall asleep with its memory is to dream the first dream of civilization that from clay and water, from struggle and hope, humanity can shape something that lasts. The story of Mesopotamia does not end with conquest, nor with ruins buried beneath the desert. It ends as it began with the rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates still flow, their waters winding through lands of dust and sun, nourishing fields as they did thousands of years ago. Their currents whisper of empires long vanished, of ziggurats crumbled to dust, of voices once pressed into clay. In the stillness of evening, one can imagine the glow of oil lamps flickering on ancient rooftops, families listening to the sound of water while elders told stories of gods and kings. The people are gone, their temples silent, their laws forgotten by their own descendants, and yet, in a way, they endure. Each time we measure time, trace words on a page, or build cities that stretch toward the sky, we continue the dream first shaped between these two rivers. Mesopotamia teaches us that civilization is both fragile and eternal. Fragile, because no wall, no law, no empire can stand forever. Eternal, because ideas once born can ripple endlessly through the ages, from Sargon's ambition to Hammurabi's justice, from Gilgamesh's longing to the humble farmer's prayer. The essence of Mesopotamia has flowed outward like its rivers, touching lands and peoples far beyond its horizon. To fall asleep with its memory is to drift upon the waters of time. We hear the chants of priests rising from ziggurats, the laughter of children running through narrow streets. The ring of bronze struck by craftsmen at dawn, we see caravans setting forth across deserts, their donkeys laden with goods, their merchants carrying dreams. We watch kings carve their names into stone, hoping to defy the silence of eternity. And finally, we return to the rivers, eternal and patient. They remind us that all human greatness is, in the end, like silt washed away, carried onward, reshaped into new forms. Yet the dream remains. Mesopotamia lives not in ruins or relics alone, but in us, in the words we speak, in the laws we follow, in the stories we tell. So close your eyes now and listen. Beneath the hush of night, beneath the pulse of your own breath, the rivers still whisper. They carry with them the first chapter of civilization, reminding us that history is not merely behind us. It flows, always beside us.